Hi friends, thank you for taking time out of your week to spend a little with me. You are greatly appreciated. This case comes to us from fellow viewer Joanne, so thank you for sharing this tragic story with us all. This week we're discussing the case of the Alday family from Donaldsonville, Georgia, a family that was sadly taken far sooner than necessary due to their paths unknowingly conjoining with a ragtag crew of prisoner escapees. So as always, I invite you to join me as we remember the Alday family. The patriarch, Ned Alday, was born on September 7, 1910 in Donaldsonville, Georgia. He met the love of his life, Ernestine, in his small community, and the two eloped in 1935. They went on to have 9 children and build up their family name. The Aldays embodied Southern hospitality. They helped their community however they could and were very wholesome people. Ned helped build the local church, the same church many members of the Alday family played vital roles in, such as officers and Sunday school teachers. They were financially responsible as well. Early in their relationship, Ned and Ernestine saved everything they had to purchase a small home that they later traded in for nearly 400 acres of farm and a much larger farmhouse located on River Road. The Aldays were very hardworking people, and the farm was a family operation. But by 1973, only 2 of their older sons stayed close enough to continue to help out. Jerry Alday, who was 25 at the time, moved into his own trailer a few miles down the road from the farm with his wife, Mary. His older brother, Chester, who the family called Shuggy, also lived in a trailer, but he was much closer. He and his wife, Barbara, opted to plot their home just yards from the family farmhouse. The Aldays were quiet people who kept to themselves. There was no criminal records and they never caused any trouble, which is why the community still has trouble shaking the horrific events of May 14, 1973. Donaldsonville, Georgia, is a hamlet about 36 miles east of Dothan, Alabama. It's very small. At the time it contained 2 schools, one for elementary and one for high school, and only had 1 library. Its economy survived on agriculture. It was a quaint southern town in a very unlikely setting for what would be called the second worst mass murder in Georgia. But before we discuss that part, we need to talk about how we got here. On May 5, 1973, in the Poplar Hill Correctional Institute, located outside of Baltimore, Maryland, was the current home of 19-year-old Carl Isaacs. Carl, who was in and out of the foster care system most of his life, was classified as not only a runaway, but a thief as well. He was described as a fast talker with a big ego, capable of swaying the toughest of men. He had a poor hold on his emotions, having outbursts over minor things, but was especially hostile towards women. Carl would often run away from foster care because he wasn't content with the conditions. During these periods, he would sell himself for places to stay. By 16, Carl was regularly committing crimes, which included stealing cars and breaking into homes. In 1970, he was arrested for the first time, but due to it being his first offense, he was not held long and was released. He learned nothing, however, and was back to the same behavior as before. He was arrested a second time in 1973 and was not so lucky. On March 27, 1973, he arrived at the Maryland State Penitentiary to begin his sentence. Shortly after his arrival, though, a riot broke out. During the riot, Carl was assaulted by fellow inmates for over 8 hours, which ultimately resulted in a transfer for his protection. He was moved to the Maryland Correctional Camp temporarily before being moved again on April 25, 1973, to the minimum security Poplar Hill. The move to Poplar Hill would be a big mistake because Carl actually had someone on the inside already. His 26-year-old half-brother named Wayne Coleman. Wayne, like Carl, spent his childhood in and out of foster care. He had a lengthy criminal past that consisted of stealing cars and breaking into homes. He had been at Poplar Hill for a few months prior to Carl's arrival. Wayne was the opposite of Carl. He was shy and kind of reserved. He would much rather follow than be a leader, and follow he did. It took Carl no time to settle in and track down Wayne. He revealed to Wayne that he had a plot to escape and he wanted him in on it. Wayne obliged with his brother, but on one condition. He had to bring his friend. This friend turned out to be 36-year-old George Dungy. George was incarcerated for failing to pay his child support, a minor crime in comparison to his counterparts. George was often remarked as having a very innocent look to him and was very trusting. Reportedly, during his time in jail, he and Wayne struck up a romantic relationship. Wayne approached George with the escape plan, and even though he was scheduled to be released soon, he agreed to join the pair. Although Carl agreed to bring George, it was not met with enthusiasm. Carl wasn't George's biggest fan, mostly due to his race. But, with the group formed, they finally carried out the breakout on May 5, 1973, around 3 in the morning. The men climbed through a bathroom window and took off through the surrounding woods. They used the woods to move before making it into Baltimore, Maryland, where they finally found a car to steal. By the time they secured transportation, the authorities at Poplar Hill were aware of their missing prisoners. However, they decided not to alert local authorities about the escapees since they weren't considered dangerous. The capture and return of the criminals did not seem to be of the utmost importance. Meanwhile, the fugitives continued to hide out in Baltimore for 2 more days before Carl decided he wanted to grab his younger brother Billy before leaving the city. Billy Isaacs was 16 at the time, and he idolized his older brother, so when he was offered a position in the car, he happily obliged. For the next week, the now ragtag team of 4 hung around Maryland until deciding to head to Pennsylvania. They quickly realized how fast their excursion was adding up, so in order to fund this trip, they decided to break into houses along the way. Carl had an ultimate goal of heading south, specifically to Florida or Mexico, where they could live out the rest of their days as free men, but they had to get there first. On May 10, 1973, while traveling near McConnellsburg, Pennsylvania, Carl decided it was time for the group to get a new car when he spotted a truck without an owner in sight, or so he thought. While attempting to take the car, the owner's neighbor, a young man named Richard Miller, spotted the theft in progress. Rather than let it go, he chased the group down. He didn't recover the vehicle, but in fact, this was the last time anyone saw the young man. Unfortunately, Richard became their first victim. It's unclear who killed him, but allegedly they argued back and forth as to who would do the job. They tied his hands behind his back and forced him on his knees before shooting him in the back of the head. They then left Richard's body down a logging road on a trash dump where they'd hope he would be forgotten. They continued on heading south until they finally touched down in Donaldsonville, Georgia on May 14, 1973. The day was seemingly normal for the Alday family. They were up early as usual, carrying out their daily routines. Ernestine spent the morning preparing lunch and completing the household chores, while the men worked on the farm. At noon, the men arrived back at the farmhouse for lunch and to discuss the remaining tasks for the day. Once the meal was finished, they returned back to work while Ernestine cleaned up. Around this time, Carl and his crew had driven through Seminole County and were nearing Jacksonville, Florida, when Carl had another idea. He noticed when passing through Donaldsonville, it was very small and rural, and to him this equated a few things: quiet, remote, and a small police force. He felt it was the perfect place to lay low because no one would think to look for them, and the people living there wouldn't know who they were. So he decided to turn the car back around and go back to Georgia. The group made it back, but practically on fumes. They were out of money and needed gas. Desperately, they started to scope the area for targets to take advantage of. It was nearing 4 p.m. by the time they spotted their mark, a trailer placed on a quiet road, with the nearest neighbor miles away. So Carl, with Wayne in tow, made his move. They broke into the trailer and started tearing it apart for anything valuable while Billy and George stayed behind playing lookout. They weren't there but for a few moments when a blue Jeep started coming down the road and Billy quickly warned Carl. Inside the Jeep was Ned Alday and his son Jerry. The pair were returning to Jerry's trailer just as they always did at the end of the workday. The crew met at Jerry's to plan out the tasks for the following day. However, when Jerry and Ned approached, they were held at gunpoint by Carl Isaacs. Carl ordered the two men to get inside of the home. Once inside, he had them turn out their pockets onto the kitchen table. He received some change and miscellaneous items, but nothing of true value. Then he separated the two. He took 35-year-old Jerry into a room at one end of the house, then took 66-year-old Ned to a room on the opposite side. Carl went in behind Jerry and shot him 4 times with a .22 caliber gun, while Wayne was in the other room handling Ned. Wayne shot Ned once in the head with a .32 caliber gun, but this shot did not stop him. He was knocked onto a bed, but rose up and tried to fight back. Carl heard the commotion and went in to assist Wayne. He shot Ned an additional 5 times with his .22 caliber weapon. Allegedly, Carl opted to hang around at the trailer until Jerry's wife Mary returned home. Prior to taking his life, Carl asked Jerry if he was married, and Jerry was honest with him. He begged for him to leave his wife alone. However, something about this only made Carl want to do it more, so he decided to wait for Mary himself. But the next Alday family member to come to the trailer was 25-year-old Jimmy. Jimmy parked the tractor before walking up to the back door, where he knocked, expecting to see his brother, but instead he was greeted by Wayne and a gun in his face. They took everything out of Jimmy's pockets, which again wasn't much. Carl was angry with his arrival, accusing him of poking around because of the gunshots, but Jimmy denied since this was their usual routine. Carl ordered the young man into the living room and put him on the couch face down. He then shot him 2 times in the back of the head with his .22 caliber gun. Carl then went outside and decided it was time for them to leave. They weren't going to wait any longer. But while moving the tractor out of the way, he heard another car pull up in front of the trailer. 25-year-old Mary Alday got out of her car and was in the trunk pulling out her bag of groceries when Carl snuck up behind her and put a gun in her back. Just like the Alday men, Mary was forced into her home. Her purse was forcefully removed and turned over onto the kitchen table, revealing just $1 and additional miscellaneous items. While handling Mary, 2 more members of the Alday family parked in front of the trailer. Chester, one of Ned's other sons, and Ned's brother Aubrey were sitting in a truck laughing and having a good conversation with one another. The laughter set Carl off, so he went outside and took the men at gunpoint into the trailer. Upon entry, Carl and Aubrey saw Mary crying uncontrollably at the table, while they were forced to sit on the kitchen floor. Mary was taken to the bathroom where George was sent in to guard her. Chester, who was 30 years old, was pushed by Wayne into the bedroom where Ned's body still sat on the floor. Wayne, with no hesitation, shot Chester once with his .380 caliber gun. Carl took Aubrey, who was 57 at the time, into the same bedroom as his nephew Jerry, and he shot him once with a .38 caliber weapon. Apparently, when the Aldays were found, Aubrey's fingers were folded over Jerry's. In his last moments, Aubrey reached out to hold his nephew's hand before sadly succumbing to his injuries. After the immense bloodshed, Mary was taken from the bathroom and into the kitchen, where Carl proceeded to assault her, and once he was done, Wayne did the same. The group finally decided it was time to go, taking not only Mary but her car as well. Carl drove his crew and hostage into a heavily wooded area miles away from the trailer. In a demeaning manner, Carl pulled Mary out of the car by her hair and assaulted her 2 more times before allowing George to do the same. They took humiliating photographs of her in a vulnerable state before deciding to end the suffering. George put Mary on her stomach on the ground and then shot her once in the back of the head with his .22 caliber gun. They abandoned both Mary and their car in the woods. Carl, Wayne, Billy, and George then piled into Mary's car before leaving the small community. The news of the murder spread quickly and really shocked the once peaceful community. Even though the community was close, the tragedy only brought them even closer. The neighbors helped out however they could, in order to assist the surviving Aldays with the big responsibility of keeping the farm running. 3 days after the murders, Donaldsonville stopped working for the day due to the funerals of the Alday family. The mayor called for a day of mourning and the streets were deserted. On May 17, 1973, the funeral processions began and nearly all of the townspeople and many from nearby counties stood outside of the Spring Creek Baptist Church. The church was too small to house 6 coffins and the amount of mourners, so the funeral was held on the church grounds. The Aldays were praised for their hard work and community commitment, but also for being the best kind of neighbors you'd want to have. The day of the funeral, the fugitives were in West Virginia before fate finally caught up to them. They were found when forced to flee on foot after running from a roadblock since they were wanted fugitives, but they were apprehended this time. It took no time for George to start talking. For 2 hours he unraveled the horrific tale of the jail breakout that ultimately led to the massacre of the Alday family. George was very apologetic for any part he played, claiming he hadn't been able to sleep for what he'd done to that woman. With George's confession, investigators tried to break down his counterparts, starting with Billy. Based on George's interview, it appeared Billy was less culpable than the other 2 men, since allegedly he didn't shoot anyone. Ballistics showed differently, though. The Aldays were killed with 4 different weapons, and one of these was carried by Billy. But after hearing Billy's story, which mirrored George's almost identically, he claimed Carl had taken his gun during the shooting of Jerry because he had run out of bullets. Since the theory couldn't be denied and Billy was too young to be eligible for the death penalty, investigators decided to turn him into their star witness in order to secure convictions against the other 3. In exchange for his testimony, Billy received 2 20-year terms for the theft charges, and he gladly obliged. After speaking to Wayne, he had a differing story from the previous 2. Wayne showed no remorse recounting the actions from that day. In fact, he was proud and took credit for taking everyone's lives. He even went as far as to smile during the recollection. And when Carl was spoken to, he refused to tell investigators anything. He would only reply, quote, "It was a pretty May day," end quote. But the evidence couldn't be denied. Their fingerprints matched those found in the trailer, the bullets in their possession matched the ones found at the scene and during the autopsies, and lastly, they were found with many of the Aldays' personal items in their possession, such as jewelry. The escapees were returned to Georgia on May 24, 1973, to be arraigned at the courthouse in Donaldsonville. George, Carl, and Wayne were faced with 6 counts of murder, as well as felony charges of assault, kidnapping, armed robbery, and grand theft. While the 3 sat in different jails miles from one another, the community was outraged and demanded justice for the Aldays. They went as far as to threaten to take matters into their own hands. But trials were being set, and despite the feelings of the townspeople, street justice wouldn't be necessary. While awaiting trial, information was brought forward that connected the missing teenager, Richard Miller from Pennsylvania, to Carl and his crew. An eyewitness had come forward and gave their account that Richard chased a group of men fitting the description of the fugitives, and law enforcement believed at this point, if it was in fact Carl, the boy was likely deceased. After additional questioning, they confessed to taking Richard's life, and Wayne Coleman decided to be the one to lead police to his body. After his arraignment, he was flown to Maryland for 3 days, where he led officers in circles around the borders of Pennsylvania and Maryland before admitting he had no clue where Richard was. He was flown back to Georgia, where this time, in a strange turn of events, Carl offered his assistance. So just like Wayne, he was transported out of state, but he proved to be much more valuable. Carl led the investigators to the small town of Flintstone, Maryland, where he provided detailed directions of where to find Richard Miller. Carl's trial commenced on December 31, 1974, where many witnesses were called to the stand. This included members of the Alday family who were able to identify several pieces of evidence that belonged to their family members that was found in the defendant's possession. And of course, the sheriff and responding officers were called on the stand. But the most surprising and final witness was, of course, his 16-year-old brother, Billy. Billy testified on January 4th for a total of 2 hours, recounting the painful last moments of the Alday family. The case went to the jury the following day, and it took a little over an hour for them to find him guilty on all charges against him. On January 7th, the jury called for the death penalty, and the judge agreed. George's trial was next, starting on January 9th, 1974, and it was very similar to Carl's. It was quick, open and shut case, and only took the jury 58 minutes to decide his fate. He was guilty on all charges and also received the death penalty. Wayne's trial lasted for 3 days, and he too received a guilty verdict on all counts and also received the death penalty. Initially, execution dates were set for February 15, 1974, but due to mandatory and automatic appeals to the Georgia Supreme Court, they were not carried out right away. For years, the men filed appeals after appeals, which only delayed the execution dates. The appeals were denied over and over again until a discovery motion in 1979 was granted, which led to retrials for all three in 1988. It was determined that due to the massive pretrial publicity, the three defendants couldn't have possibly received a fair trial and should have been granted a change in venue, so sentencing was overturned and new trials were ordered. While awaiting trial, Carl filed several lawsuits against the prison system claiming mistreatment, but he was not victorious in any of them. Also during this time, writer and filmmaker Fleming Fuller was in the process of producing a film on the Alday family murders. Fleming interviewed Carl, taping his confession, which would later prove to be a problem. Carl Isaacs was again the first of the three to head back to the courtroom in January of 1988. The trial was nearly identical to the first, except this time around Ernestine testified. This resulted in emotional outbursts from the Alday family present. However, in order to avoid a potential mistrial, the Alday family members were asked to hold their composure in order to protect Carl's rights. If the jury saw the family's outburst, it could result in them unfairly ruling against Carl. So the judge had to issue warnings that if anyone couldn't contain their emotions, they would have to leave. On January 23, 1988, Billy testified against his brother once again, including the exact same series of events as he did all those years ago. The previously taped interviews with Fleming Fuller were also brought into this trial, and in a weird turn of events, Carl was in a way a witness against himself. His taped interviews showed an emotionless, evil person reliving just what he'd done. 2 days later, on January 25th, the jury deliberated for 2 hours before reaching the verdict. Carl was still guilty on all counts. During the sentencing phase, his lawyer tried to argue against the death penalty, this time around by bringing witnesses to testify to his character. This included a woman who corresponded with Carl for a period of time. He participated in Bible study with her and had for years. He was also baptized in 1979 and took courses where he earned a Master of Bible Theology. She believed that he was kind and able to help people, whereas prosecution brought forth a reporter who interviewed Carl years prior. During the interview, she asked Carl if released would he do it again, and Carl responded, "Yes, I would kill again." The jury once again deliberated for almost 2 hours before declaring that Carl was in fact deserving of the death penalty. Wayne Coleman's trial took place in April of 1989, where his attorney attempted to blame everyone else, stating Wayne was the target of manipulation. His trial also seemed to be a repeat of the previous one, where they relied on the available evidence and Billy's testimony. By April 19th, the jury deliberated, and he was found guilty on all 6 counts once again. During his penalty phase, his attorneys put a psychologist on the stand to testify that Wayne was actually very passive in nature and had a follower mentality, and if it hadn't have been for this, he would have never done anything like this. Due to his mental instability, he was the perfect victim for Carl. He stated he felt guilt every day and prayed for forgiveness. His sentencing became a long, drawn-out process due to a stalemate amongst the jury for 6 days. By May 11th, after 35 hours of deliberation, the jury declared they were in a deadlock and couldn't decide Wayne's fate, and the judge was forced to declare a mistrial under Georgia law. After another round of jurors, Wayne received a life sentence this time around and was eligible for parole after serving 15 years. However, he didn't appeal further. Lastly, George was set up for his retrial in 1988, but the Georgia General Assembly declared that mentally deficient individuals could not be executed in Georgia. George was given a number of IQ tests. The judge declared anyone under 70 was considered legally mentally incompetent, and George always scored under 68. On January 14, 1988, he pled guilty by reason of mental deficiency, where he was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms. Sadly, as a result of the murders, the Alday family not only suffered from the loss of their family, but also their business. Without the extra help on the farm, it wasn't feasible to continue to work so many acres of farmland. So the farming equipment was sold. In another terrible blow, it was discovered that Ned had actually deeded his property to his sons Jerry, Chester, and Jimmy as a means of protecting the family's assets. But since all 4 of the men tragically passed away, the property was passed to Mary, since she officially outlived them and inherited the whole property except for a small piece of land that went to Chester's wife, Barbara. And since Mary's family were her only heirs, they inherited the Aldays' property. A small part of land was sold off and given to Ernestine, where she built a home, but she lost all other assets. Ernestine died in 1988 and was buried alongside her husband and children in the Spring Creek Baptist Church Cemetery. Several movies and books have been created about the Alday family, including the movie Murder One in 1988 and the books Blood Echo by Thomas H. Cook and Brothers in Blood by Clark Howard. Billy Isaacs was released in 1993 after serving 20 years of his sentence. Billy died on May 4, 2009 in Florida at the age of 51. George Dungy died of a heart attack on April 4, 2006 at the age of 68 in the Reidsville, Georgia prison. On May 16, 2003, nearly 30 years after his escape, Carl Isaacs' death sentence was carried out. He requested a final meal of a prison meal tray, and by 8:07 p.m., he was pronounced dead by lethal injection. None of his family members attended, but the surviving Aldays did, marking the first time in Georgia that victimized families were allowed to watch a perpetrator's sentence be carried out. In the following years after his death, he was connected to another unrelated murder in Pennsylvania, a 58-year-old woman named Ann Elder in January of 1973. Wayne Coleman continues to serve his sentence at the Wilcox State Prison. He continues to go up for parole but is denied every time. He is currently 76 years old. Thank you again, Joanne, for sharing this tragic case with all of us. We appreciate you spreading awareness about the Aldays. I also want to take a second to thank you all for tuning in, because I've been absent for quite a bit, if you've noticed or if you haven't noticed, and thank you to all of you who reached out to check on me. I had this crazy turn of events where I initially recorded this video almost a week and a half, maybe even 2 weeks ago, but all of my audio files got corrupted and I lost all of them. And literally the next day I was going to go and record again and I lost my voice. I got really sick and I caught bronchitis. So I've been down and out for almost like 3 weeks now, but that doesn't matter. I'm back. I'm happy to be back. I hope you guys are happy to have me back, because I'm going to just keep pushing forward from here, and fingers crossed I don't get sick anymore. I think I'm just gonna start staying home. But as always, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts, so please leave them below and we can chat about it. Also, if you found this to be informative, please consider giving the video a thumbs up to let YouTube know you want more. And lastly, if you're not subscribed yet, you should, because we would love to have you under the ash tree. Thank you to all you beautiful people. I would not be here without you. I appreciate all of your support and kind words, and I hope you have an awesome week ahead of you. As always, I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, friends!